Welcome to the show, guys. I mean, normally I'd say welcome to the show, but usually you're in this seat, Khendr'a. How does it feel to be our special guest today?
It's definitely different bit on the other side, right? But yeah, happy to be here. Happy to talk about data.
Happy to have you. We know you've flown in from Charlotte, so welcome to London. We're happy to have you here.
Yeah.
Jason, welcome back to the show. Always appreciate your insights, so thanks for joining us today.
And thanks for having us back in the studio today. Really bad weather today in London, so great that we're doing it indoors.
Awesome. So it's actually, I think, quite relevant that we have somebody from the US and somebody from the UK, because what we want to talk about today is something that's on top of mind for a lot of customers now, which is how do you manage data regulations when you have data both in the US or the UK? Say for a holding company that has operations in both, or sales offices cross Atlantic, or maybe a US company acquired a UK company or vice versa. That's something we want to dive into today. So looking over, let's say, the past 5 years, what factors have driven the focus on increased data regulation when it comes to key issues like data sharing, cross-border, data sovereignty, etc.?
Well, I mean, I'll go first. If you think about, what has happened in the last 10 years, it's no coincidence that Amazon Web Services, its key component of cloud computing has then made it more evident that people need to understand where their data resides. So there's always been this case where customers who use the cloud have a question mark over where the data is stored. That's always been bubbling under the surface. And obviously with Amazon Web Services, we have a shared responsibility model. So it was always the case that the customers have control over where that data is. But because, as you said, Ismail, there is this trend where companies are now working across the globe. They are putting different data elements. They operate in hub and spoke models. It's become more evident that where the data they think is residing may not actually be the case. A lot of larger companies operate multi-cloud. So they will have different data in different regions across different cloud providers. So tracking where that data is going to be quite hard in today's world. And I think that has made the problem more severe than it was maybe 10, 15 years ago when data was always just sitting in that mainframe. You knew exactly where it is because you can go downstairs. That's where it was on that rack. But Khendr'a, what's your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think in general, the world itself has gotten smaller, right? In the way that we operate, the way that we share data, the way that we utilize data. So being more cognizant of how the data is being utilized, especially depending on where the data resides, has been more and more important. First of all, larger organizations that are global, many financial institutions are global, et cetera. And so understanding, the data that is residing in Europe and how, someone in the US may be accessing that has been very critical in the last few years.
So the tech's in place now where you need to really make an intentional decision about where to keep your data with the advent of the cloud. Has the regulation caught up to the tech as well? And has that caused any kind of pressure that's made organizations think about this more deeply?
Yeah, from a regulatory standpoint, there's very different thinking in terms of how organizations should be treating their data. In Europe, there's been more of a concerted effort, particularly in public sector, to look at how they can regulate how data is shared, particularly government data where you've got personally identified information, national security implications. Governments particularly have put in these systems of play where you can actually track where that data is. One good example is GaiaX. GaiaX is a construct that is being developed in the Nordic countries that allows different organizations at the government level to share data freely, but have certain guardrails in place. And this concept of having these data contracts where when data is used, how it's being used, how you are pseudo-anonymizing that data, that's been done with GaiaX. But that's just one pocket, in one area of Europe. And I wouldn't say that is being federated to different parts of the world.
And how are organizations actually implementing this across the US and UK with the different rules and different regulations in place?
Yeah, I think there's different approaches, right? Depending on the organization, kind of depending on their maturity, et cetera, kind of talking with, Jason about what he just said around, depending on the organization, depending on where they reside, there might be different regulations, right? So if it's a company that is global, like a financial institution, that if they're in Europe, you can think about GDPR, as opposed to the US, there isn't necessarily a GDPR standard, right? And so how do you set up a infrastructure in a way or an environment in a way that allows and accounts for those aspects for the data that is in Europe as well as the data that is in the U.S. as well. So in general, one of the ways that they're doing that is, kind of moving some of that sensitive information is utilize some of that newer technology like generative AI, right? Being able to create fake data, to be able to utilize it and be able to leverage it just as if it was the real data itself, right? To help remove that risk. But then there's other various ways as well, right? From security, from the access controls, et cetera, and really ensuring that the way that they approach it is ensuring that they can get access to the data, but also keeping the security and regulations in place at the same time.
Okay, so it's a combination of using, data masking, PII redaction, let's say certain pre-processing technologies, plus security and access control to the right people, at the right time with the right data set.
Exactly.
So thinking about that a bit further, with this trend now of keeping data local because the regulations are more stringent, how do we balance that trend and that regulatory pressure with also having a big picture view of the data? Because you do want to see all of, let's say, the trends across your whole organization around the world, but you also want to respect individuals' privacy and adhere to whatever rules and regulations are put in place for each locale for which you have your data.
Yeah. I think it really comes down to the classic tale that we've been talking on this channel around understanding what the data is used for, understanding those use cases. There's been a concerted effort to try and centralize the data, to make it, very tightly wound in terms of how the data should be used. But then there's obviously, as you said, there's a pressure to try and empower people to use the data. So there is this push and pull. I think where you need to then, define how data is used is critical, making it clear that the use cases that you're using the data actually drive the value, justifying that use case is for the greater good. I think there's always been a worry that people are thinking that data is used for nefarious purposes.
Yeah.
And whether or not that's true, if people are using data for marketing purposes, they're getting spammed, I think that really comes down to making sure that you have the people who are using the data doing it, with the right course of action that the company or the entity is looking for as the overall vision. So setting that overall vision of how data is used, having what we call tenets in place, and then the use cases selected to understand how data is moved, how it's used, and then having everyone agree, I think is critical to that. I think the other side is that, when you think about data collaboration, the advent of clean room environments allow you to share data more freely. And as Khendr'a, you mentioned, is either creating fake data or hiding the data. So we're actually seeing that the use cases are more cross-industry in nature. Particularly in healthcare and in government, there needs to be more of an effort to understand how data can help power better patient outcomes. And we're seeing that a lot in the United States. But then that comes with a raft of different regulations. You can't share patient data freely, but you still need to use the data to then drive the right patient outcomes. So I think that there is more of a need to then broadcast those use cases. Tell people up front, we're using it for this purpose. This is how we're creating the guardrails and hiding the data, and creating that transparency. And as we know the technology is available now. Now we need people to catch up to the process of telling people how data is used and not just relying on technology doing everything for you.
So from what you're saying, it seems to me like the key is that you have to look at this in terms of the use case and what business value it offers, and then look at that use case closely to see where the regulatory risk is, and then apply kind of anonymization technologies or pre-processing steps to it, like injecting fake data, like redacting PII data, etc., and then being able to use something like clean rooms, for example, where you have a data collaboration environment where you could look at the patterns as a whole without exposing individual components of data, let's say. What other techniques or approaches are being used now to share data securely, especially in the context of cross-border transactions or cross-border sharing in the same organization?
Yeah, I think another way that is being approached is kind of what we've talked about a lot on this channel, is like the modern data community approach, right? So we have these global organizations, having the producers of those data really own that data, right? So the person that's producing the data is in Europe. They don't want to own that data, understand what regulations needs to be in place around that data and who can access it, how they should be accessing it. And then on the consumer side, with those data contracts, like Jason mentioned, being able to leverage those that are being created by those producers and understand, hey, this is what this data should be used for. This is how I can use it. This is who I can share it with or who I cannot share it with. It's kind of how they're approaching that, right? A good example is ENGIE, right? And they're a global organization in various countries around the world, and they're able to connect all their different entities together using that producer and consumer concept to make sure they met their all regulatory, not even just at an industry level, but internally, right? Companies have their own security and compliance methods that they're trying to do. And so that's just one of the ways that they're going about implementing those.
Data contracts, that's an interesting concept. For those who haven't heard about it before, can you expand a little bit on it? What is it? Why is it useful? Why is it useful now, especially?
Yeah. So if you think about the concept of a contract, historically it's a binding agreement. It's written upfront. The people who are, signing the contract need to adhere to all the terms and conditions. And that same applies with a data contract, understanding what the data is, the quantifiable metrics in terms of the metadata of the data, putting that into the contract and saying, based on the attributes of this data, consumers can and cannot do X, Y, and Z. But technology now is able to then track how data is used. So you can see whether or not a contract has been voided when a data consumer is using it for an inappropriate purpose. So, data contracts is a way to have an immutable way to give that transparency of when data is produced, it is used for that right purpose. And it comes down to this modern data community. There's a level of trust there. And maybe that's something which sometimes can be centralized, where people own those data contracts centralized. But as Khendr'a mentioned, the domain, particularly in regulations in government, you need to push that to the edges of the organization. You can't guess what regulations are from a central function.
So that's interesting. We're now moving more from a centralized IT approach where they are responsible for controlling the data, where you actually have a zero trust model similar to blockchain, for example, where you have contracts between two parties and the technology can enforce the contract between them, making the adherence to regulations inherent in the technology itself. And this is a way of scaling sharing and regulation and, in fact, democratizing data across the organization. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd say that has been very much the genesis in the last 2-3 years around how the technology can provide that transparency. Another good way that we can kind of see this is generative AI in the last 2-3 years allows you to read the context behind how data is moved, how it's shared. So you can very easily now just prompt engineer onto a generative AI application, what it sees when a data is moved from the US to the UK, who is consuming it, and then provide that summary. So no longer do you need a auditing function, come in and then find out how that data contract has been voided.
If we have leaders who are using data to make these decisions and they have this kind of landscape where they need to find a secure way to share data across border, what would you advise them? What are the key things that they need to take into account?
I think the first thing is understanding how the data is going to be used, right? Kind of what Jason mentioned, understanding the use case, the business use case that you're looking at, and then working back through there to understand what is the regulations, et cetera, that might be associated with the use of that data, and then identifying the technology that might need to be leveraged in order to do that there.
Yeah, I definitely say that it's very much starting from the basics of what an organization already has in terms of its resources, and that's the people who understand those regulations, getting them to understand that whatever is in their head, how do you federate that out? You put that into the technology, so technology can almost understand when there are shifts in regulation. And in the changing world that we have today, we need to have that domain expertise really tapped into the data environment rather than being siloed in different parts of the organization. So having leaders understand that their human resource is just as critical as the technology resource is critical, and then working backwards from that.
So we need to work backwards from the business case and work backwards from the regulation and get the domain experts on the table.
But it's also a two-way street. We're seeing a lot of organizations, particularly tapped into government entities, sharing that feedback of how their consumers, how their entities are using the data, and that then advises how regulation should change. it's always been the case historically that governments set the regulation from top down and they expect organizations to be enforcing that regulation. But actually now with the observability platforms that we have available, organizations can share that back to their regulator and say, we're seeing this happen. We think you should maybe consider these changes to provoke the right outcomes for our consumers. And I think that bi-directional flow is really important, as opposed to a top-down approach that has always been the case in the last 50 years.
Yeah, this back and forth would be much more useful instead of having people who have the tech, they just start to do things that would look like a violation, but because the regulation hasn't caught up, it's not. And then people could be at risk or they could be harmed. So now having that two-way street, we get to have a discussion of, okay, we need this data because it will add this value, but then they could come back and say, okay, but it presents this risk. And then we can just iterate on the balance between the value and the risk throughout our technology operations, basically. And that becomes the new normal, rather than, like you said, you do the thing and then wait for 50 years or however many years until the regulation catches up.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that, you know, the advent of the cloud has really helped to spur thinking around, you know, where to put your data, where to share, how to share it, data sovereignty, data regulations, etc. What can a hyperscaler or cloud provider offer to help the organizations that are using their platform at this journey? So AWS, for example, how could they help in helping to share data securely, in helping to maintain data sovereignty, in helping to adhere to data regulations like GAIA-X, like GDPR, like FedRAMP, like HIPAA, etc.?
Yeah, I think one of the ways is, of course, on the technology side, right? We have the technology you said meet a lot of those regulations and ensuring that, you know, if it's FedRAMP, et cetera, that the data meets those regulations that are in place there. The other side is having the experts that have worked sometimes in those organizations or are experts in those industries that are regulated and how other companies may be doing and how the best way to approach it to ensure that you're not being hindered in tackling new use cases, doing things like generative AI, being more innovative. So still being able to do that, but also being able to meet the regulation aspect.
Jason, Khendr'a, thank you so much for coming. This has been super useful. I think a lot of organizations who need to think about sharing data across the US, UK, or any country or any locality will find a lot of insights from this talk. I learned a lot. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks a lot.